Looking to find out what's happening on the NDSU campus? Watch Bison Information Network News every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday on Cable One Channel 70. This student-run weekly newscast covers relevant news and current events, entertainment, Bison sports, and more. Watch BIN News Fridays at 9 p.m., Saturdays at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., and Sundays at 9 a.m. on Cable One Channel 70.
Bison Information Network News is brought to you in partnership with Cable One.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of X's and O's. I'm Jay Lennander.
And I'm Joe Thompson.
And today we have an episode filled with football talk. First we're going to be talking local college football, and then later on in the show after a break we'll be talking about the NFL. But Joe, we'll be starting with the Bison football team. Had their last game of the regular season, their first undefeated season since 2013. We saw a huge margin of victory. What did you take away from this game against the Salukis?
Main thing that I saw was just total domination. It was a bit of a rough start with that opening kickoff return for a touchdown, and then that big pass play to tie things up at 14. But pretty much after that, it was all Bison from there on out. So
yeah, absolutely. It was a little bit nerve-wracking at the beginning. Especially with the opening kickoff, it's like, uh-oh, is this going to go in a different direction in a way that we didn't think it was going to go?
Yeah, exactly.
But then as soon as it's after 21-14, then it just started piling up, and Easton Stick really took over.
Yeah, absolutely. He balled out on his senior day. He threw the ball well. He made great throws. He ran the ball well. He handed off the ball well, I guess, too. That works.
Yeah. He was absolutely the catalyst in this game. He had 3 straight touchdown passes for like 60 yards, 22, and then 31. 3 touchdown passes in a row off of turnovers. Of course, the defense was also in on that play, but Easton Stick was making some huge passes. And that's really what led to the 65-17 score that we saw on Saturday. After the game, the coach Kleiman was very happy with the result, saying that it was hard for any team to go perfect in that division that they play in. And what's more important about the game, as we saw on Sunday, is that the Bison team, they got a big win. They secured this perfect season, securing the #1 seed in the FCS Playoffs, which at 11:30 on Sunday, the NCAA selection show revealed the final bracket for the NCAA FCS tournament. And we are going to be talking about this pretty extensively right now. We're going to be looking at everything that's going on with the FCS, especially with NDSU. So, Joe, we've got the brackets in front of us. What was your first reaction when you saw this?
When I first saw it, I was like, this is going to be rather tough for the Bison. This is one of their more tougher schedules in the playoff bracket that I've seen since I've been a student here. To have a possibility of playing James Madison in the quarterfinals, and if we survive that, then we have to play likely either South Dakota State or Kennesaw, which are some of the top teams in the FCS. So I think it's going to be a real challenge.
Absolutely. I think when you look at the bracket, specifically at the path North Dakota State has to go through, their first round is going to be pretty easy, no matter who it is, Montana State or Incarnate Word. I mean, Montana State, they ended up beating Montana in that big rivalry game to end their season, and they've got an okay team, but okay doesn't do it against the Bison. Yeah. But once you get past that, that's when it starts to get interesting. There is a very real possibility that we could see NDSU having to face James Madison and South Dakota State before they even get to the semifinal round. Oh, no. They would get to the before they even get to Frisco. We could see North Dakota State having to face James Madison and South Dakota State, 2 of their biggest rivals from the past couple of years, if not all of history with SCSU. And Joe, we saw South Dakota State, who is very possibly either them or Kennesaw State, likely coming out of the other side of this portion of the bracket. We've seen South Dakota State take NDSU into the 4th quarter in a game this year, something that has been very uncommon throughout the year as NDSU has had their perfect season. Do you think that SDSU is going to have a different mindset coming into this game? Do you think that SDSU stands a chance the second time around after they've seen NDSU already once?
Well, I think so. South Dakota State knows North Dakota State better than anybody. Even if you lose guys like Jake Winicky and Dallas Goddard, you still have a very dangerous team. They know how to play NDSU well. They've played well against them the last 3 seasons. even in playoffs and not in playoffs. It's a really tough matchup for the Bison every single time. So we'll see what happens. I think they will come in with like the same with like a mindset of like, we know we can beat this team. We beat them 2 out of the last 3 years. And I think it'll be a really interesting challenge for them if they make it to that semifinal game.
But even before the semifinal game, let me get your thoughts on James Madison this year. Obviously, the biggest challenge for North Dakota State each of the past 2 years, defeating them 2 years ago in the semifinal game, which stopped the Bison streak of many championships in a row. It could
Painful.
be even longer now if they hadn't lost that game to James Madison. But James Madison, they've lost some games. They're 8-3 this year, and didn't even get seeded in the playoffs.
That was really shocking to me. I think even their coach was quoted as saying it was pretty disrespectful of the committee to not even rank them in one of the 8 seeds. So,
and it's not like they've got an easy matchup either in the first round. Delaware, a top 10 FCS defense, who the Bison saw early, obviously wasn't exactly a close game, but NDSU did have at least a risk of losing against Delaware. They were seeded in the FCS rankings early on. But James Madison, if they get past Delaware, they're going to have to get past Colgate to get to NDSU. But let's just, for speculation's sake, assume that NDSU and James Madison meet up in the quarterfinals on December 7th or 8th. What do you think that game is going to be like for North Dakota State? Because the last time James Madison was in the Fargo Dome, it was that loss in the semifinal game.
Yeah.
Do you think that James Madison, despite the rough year that they've had so far, that they're going to be able to overcome that, and once it comes down to crunch time, they're going to be able to face up against NDSU the way they have been the past 2 years?
I definitely think so. I think that James Madison, with the way they played the season, being not even ranked in the playoffs, having lost to NDSU in the national championship game last year, I think they're going to come in with the absolute biggest chip on their shoulder. They know they came in here 2 years ago and just kind of exposed the Bison, really. And biggest thing for me is, like, are they going to come in with that same swagger? They're going to have to come in with a chip on their shoulder, and it's going to be a slugfest without a doubt.
And we've talked a lot about how this bracket is absolutely loaded in terms of the path that NDSU is going to have to take in order to get back to Frisco, meeting some of their biggest rivals, or potentially some surprises like Kennesaw State, also on that bracket. But let's shift down to the other side. Let's talk about who the Bison, if they do make it to Frisco, which of course it's still very likely that they make it to Frisco because this team has been lights out all year long. Looking at the other side of the bracket, what are some of the teams that really stand out to you as a potential option for the Bison to have to face in Frisco should they make it there?
I mean, you got to go with like your Eastern Washingtons. Weber State, I was a little bit surprised that they got the 2 seed. I thought that was all but a lock for Kennesaw State to get the 2 seed. But I think Weber State is also a formidable opponent. You can't really overlook any opponent that's ranked in the top 8 in the FCS bracket. But as far as like teams that have a legitimate chance to make it to the Frisco and potentially play NDSU, you got to go with like the top 2 seeds, Eastern Washington and Weber State.
Yeah, and Eastern Washington, another team that NDSU has some history with. They very much could see a greatest hits run for the NDSU over this year, is that they could end up facing James Madison, then SDSU, then Eastern Washington.
Yeah.
Over the past couple of years, like those are the teams you talk about in preseason when you're talking about NDSU. Obviously, Eastern Washington was one of the first 2 teams to draw NDSU into overtime in the Fargo Dome 2 years ago. The first obviously being Charleston Southern. But then we played them last year as well, and it wasn't as close of a game, this time being in Eastern Washington. Obviously, the Bison had a bit of a chip on their shoulder as well, because the last time they had been in Eastern Washington playing on that red field, that was the only other time that NDSU had lost in a semifinal game before getting to Frisco. So do you think if it ends up being NDSU, Eastern Washington, a game that we haven't seen in Frisco, but we've seen in the Fargo Dome and in Eastern Washington in the playoffs, do you think that that game is going to be a challenge for NDSU? Do you think that do you think that Eastern Washington is the team to look out for against the Bison?
I think so. You can't really overlook, like I said, you can't really overlook any team. Eastern Washington, I think they've dropped off just a little bit from what I saw 2 years ago when they had a really dominant team. I remember I was at that game when that went to overtime, and their quarterback was just throwing like right in between 2 or 3 defenders, and kept the game so close. It was really unbelievable. Unfortunately, they lost in that semifinal game to Youngstown State and Bo Pelini. But I think other than like James Madison and South Dakota State, Eastern Washington is another pretty big rival. Going back to that 2010 semifinal game, I wasn't like fully into NDSU at that point, but from what I remember, there was like a controversial fumble from Brock Jensen that a lot of people thought wasn't a fumble. So I think Eastern Washington could, and despite of their record, could still be a tough challenge for NDSU, just given the past history, and they know how to play them.
Yeah, I think for me, Eastern Washington is definitely the team to look out for. I mean, Weber State, they have the record, but a lot of other teams are 9-2 as well.
Yeah.
Weber State doesn't stand out to me as much as maybe, say, Jacksonville State, another team that NDSU has obviously a lot of recent history with, being the team that NDSU took down in Carson Wentz's finale game. But Eastern Washington, they still got Gage Gubrud, who obviously you addressed as the quarterback. They don't have players like Cooper Kupp, who's obviously gone on to NFL fame.
Yeah.
But this team, because of Gubrud and just the way they're run, it's a strong enough organization to be up there in terms of name brand with James Madison, with SDSU, with NDSU in terms of FCS dominance over the past couple of years. And to me, obviously, that's the team that stands out in terms of teams that are on the other side of the bracket from NDSU, because it just seems so unbalanced the way it's set up. It is that there's so much talent up in NDSU's ranks, but when you look on the other side, Eastern Washington and everyone else, really, because there are teams that NDSU has matched up with, like San Diego, also on that side, but they're not teams that NDSU really got a challenge from.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so let's move on to just quickly, now that the season's over, taking a look at everything that's happened, who is your offensive and defensive MVPs for the Bison so far this year?
Offensive-wise, I think you got to go Easton Stick. I think I would want to go Bruce Anderson and like Ty Brooks, but I think Easton, just as the leader of that team, he's like the engine of like a giant, of like a huge plane.
And Bruce has had some injury concerns, which have slowed him down. He's missed a couple games, so it's kind of hard to argue that, but especially with Easton.
Yeah, and then defensively wise, I think I got to go with a tie between Robbie Grimsley and Jabril Cox. And Jabril Cox had several pick sixes early on in this season and has been a key contributor on defense all year. Robbie Grimsley as well has had like several interceptions throughout the season. He's one of the top defensive safeties in Bison history and probably FCS history as well. So I think I really can't choose between those two guys.
Yeah, I think I have to agree with you along those lines. I guess I'll start with defensive. Man, it really is tough between Cox and Grimsley, because I do think those are the two guys that you have to look at.
Yeah.
There really haven't been anyone else who's made those kind of impacts. Obviously, with Robbie Grimsley putting himself into a tie for second place all-time NDSU interceptions with his former teammate Trey Dempsey and some player from the 80s, which I'm not going to try and remember who it is. Just I'd botch it, and I don't want to do any disrespectful things like that. But I think I'd have to give the edge. First half of the season was definitely Jabril Cox, but I think these last couple games it's been Robbie Grimsley.
Yeah.
Just as him being a senior, he's one of the major leaders of this team on defense, and so I guess I'd have to say Robbie Grimsley for me. In terms of offense, my answer has to be Darius Shepard. Because Darius Shepard, throughout his entire Bison career, has always sort of been the second fiddle. He's been behind Zach Vraw. He's been behind R.J. Erzendowski. He's always been the second guy. But this year, his senior year, was his year to be the guy, the senior captain, number one receiver, number one on the depth chart. And he's run with it. He's made so many big plays. He's been the guy that Easton Stick can go to. And Easton Stick, he's been fantastic all year long. But Darius Shepard, to me, he's a big reason why Easton's doing so well, because he's been such a versatile threat. He's that go-to guy, and I don't think that Easton's had anyone be as much of a go-to guy as Darius Shepard has been. And then he also has been making impacts on special teams with his return ability. I really think that's why Darius Shepard's the guy for me.
Yeah, you bring up very good points there. I didn't even think of Darius Shepard when you asked me that question.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why he's like such an obvious MVP pick for me is because you wouldn't think of him. He's always sort of blended into the background. But in terms of his skills as a wide receiver, he's just been so effective for the Bison this year, and I think that's why he's my offensive MVP for the Bison this year.
All right.
And so when we come back, we're going to stick on the topic of football, but this time we're going to be talking about the NFL. Everything that's going on, we're just going to be covering the NFL in its totality when we come back.
Conveniently located across the street from NDSU's campus, Herd and Horns is the place to go, whether you're looking for a fantastic meal or just a quick bite to eat.
Hi, welcome to Herd and Horns. Are you from the drink right away?
With friendly staff and excellent service, it's a restaurant for all ages. Herd and Horns, your home for great food and Bison sports. Welcome to Bison Block. If you are an NDSU student, you know it well. It's located right across the street from campus. How would you like to live in the same building as Starbucks, Jimmy John's, and Herd and Horns? Bison Block offers high-quality apartments at a very affordable price. For more information, go to our website at bisonblockfargo.com to apply today.
Welcome back to X's and O's, and we're going to be moving on to the NFL. The Minnesota Vikings had a huge game last night. Everyone was talking about it being such a decisive game within the NFC North Division against the Chicago Bears, and obviously we saw the outcome not exactly in their favor. It was a back-and-forth game, especially at the end when they're trying to sort of resurrect themselves from being so far behind. But, Joe, we didn't really see the best from the Vikings last night.
No, it was a particularly frustrating game to see. I didn't watch the full game because I had something else going on. But from what I saw, it seemed like the offense wasn't clicking at all. It partly had to do a little bit with that overthrowing Diggs on that wide open route. He ran a beautiful route, but Kirk just overthrew him. And then like a couple plays later, it led to the Dalvin Cook fumble, which I thought, just like the Adam Thielen fumble against the Saints a couple weeks ago in another Sunday Night Football game, just flipped momentum right away.
Yeah, the Dalvin Cook fumble was the catalyst of this game. It's basically why they lost. And they tried to come back at the end. It was at least interesting up until the end because they were still in it. I mean, kudos to them for sticking in it. But this was emblematic of the Vikings season as a whole. They have games when they're on and they can't be touched. And they've had more games than that where they are either fighting back and forth or they just can't do anything. And it's especially with offense. Like, the defense has been pretty consistent in terms of it's going to give up a fair amount of points. It's not the defense from last year, despite having most of the personnel, even some better personnel than they did last year. But the offense is really the concern this year. And when you're paying $84 million for your franchise quarterback, it's hard to see that as acceptable. But what part of the offense do you think is most to blame for their struggles?
I think you got to go offensive line. It's one of the worst in the entire NFL. You saw Khalil Mack just had his way with both right and left tackles. I believe there was a highlight where he literally shoved Riley Reiff to the ground with one arm.
Yeah, I saw that.
They allowed 17 pressures last night, most in any NFL game so far this season. So I think you got to place it firmly on the offensive line, even though Kirk made some really bad throws, and the running game just never got going.
Yeah, it's easy when you're paying players so much to be, say, the quarterback or the running back, because Dalvin Cook, he's been injured sort of off and on the entire year. He's been not incredibly effective when he has been here. His production's at least been at Latavius Murray's level, if not a little bit below it. He has had a couple big plays that Murray doesn't necessarily have, those big 80-yard runs. But that doesn't really make up for the fact that he hasn't been that guy.
Yeah.
And part of that is the offensive line, but there is also part of it that comes from being injured so much, being out of the game for almost all of last year. He has not looked like that rookie player that we saw.
Yeah, absolutely. I think ACL injuries are so difficult to come back from. The one exception was Adrian Peterson in his 2012 MVP season, but that's like finding a needle in a haystack. You're not going to get that every single year. Like, look at Carson Wentz. He's been struggling this season after his ACL injury, so it's really ACL injuries are just so hard to come back from and be as consistent as you were when you first started.
Well, before the season started for the Vikings, we saw a lot of teams having them as the favorite, mainly due to the players that they had on the team. And then beyond that, once they started going, players like Adam Thielen having a historical year really even furthered that sentiment. Now, looking at this team and where they are, do you see this year as a lost cause for them? Do you think that they're not going to make the playoffs this year?
I don't think that at all. I consider myself to be an optimist, and while last game was frustrating, they're not out of it. They're well within contention to still technically in the race to win the division, and for sure, if they can keep pace with if they beat the Packers, they got a tough last few games at the end of the season. They play the Packers, which is always tough with Aaron Rodgers. They play the Patriots, who need no introduction. They play a couple other tough teams.
The
Seahawks, which is always tough.
A team that they are in direct competition with.
Yeah, absolutely.
As the Seahawks, they're not going to win that division. Seahawks is the biggest problem for me that I saw when looking over the standings last night as the Vikings slowly lose. It's like, okay, where are we now? The biggest problem for me, I think, in terms of the Vikings' playoff chances is it's going to be so hard to secure a wild card spot this year. There's so many teams that are going to be in it, and there's not enough spots. One of the things that is interesting is that now that Washington's quarterback, Alex Smith, likely done for the year, that might shift the NFC East a little bit, and that they might not have to produce a wild card spot. But even then, the teams there, the Eagles, the Cowboys, they both have basically the same record as the Vikings do.
Yeah.
The Seahawks has the same records that the Vikings do. The Panthers have the same record that the Vikings do. And then beyond that, you've got teams like the Falcons who are also right there. There are so many teams sort of in the same spot. And I guess my next question for you is, at this point, in terms of the NFC, who do you think the two wild card spots are?
That's a tough one to judge because, like you said, there's so many teams. I think a mortal lock right now is for sure the Panthers. I think it's tough. Like, they're not going to catch the Saints. Nobody can catch the Saints right now. They're the hottest team since the Rams finally lost to the Saints, and they have the best offense in the NFL by far. Drew Brees is having an MVP-like season. Alvin Kamara is just a stud. Michael Thomas is one of the best receivers in the game, and they have a stud offensive line and a really good run defense. Pass defense is really their only weakness I see. So I think with the Panthers, I think they should just be focusing on trying to get to that wild card game.
Yeah, I think one thing that we can absolutely agree on is that the NFC has two teams that are locks at this point. The LA Rams, who are playing tonight, like right now. And the New Orleans Saints. Those two have locks in their divisions, which, bringing it back to the Vikings for a little bit, is one of the advantages that they do have. Yes, the Bears have a sizable lead considering how close everything is in the NFC North. But like you said, it's not over yet in terms of the NFC North. Would you say that the Vikings have to win the NFC North to make the playoffs? And do you think that it would take the Bears sort of dropping the ball for them to do so?
I think to win the division, yes, the Bears would have to completely drop the ball, I think, because the Bears have been rolling ever since they got Khalil Mack. Yeah, they struggled week 1 against the Packers and had a little bit of a struggle against the Dolphins. But other than that, I mean, they've been absolutely destroying every team that they've played. So I think in order for the Vikings to win the division, the Bears would certainly have to drop the ball. Would they need to win the division to make the playoffs? That I'm not so sure of. The winning the division obviously helps. It gives you like a top 4 seed, but it's just they can win out or not even like maybe go 3-1. If they're lucky, go 2-2. I think they can still grab that 6th seed or that 5th seed.
Yeah, I think it's possible, but they've definitely made it very hard for themselves. But let's shift our vantage point from the NFC to the AFC, looking at all the teams except for the Chiefs and maybe the Steelers. So Tom Brady and the Patriots have had a little bit of a down year so far.
For sure.
Lost some games that they shouldn't have. Obviously, they're on a bye week this week, which helps them recover from the loss against the Tennessee Titans the week before. But the AFC East, looking at them, it's still the Patriots.
Yeah.
So when we look at these teams, it's Pittsburgh in the North, Kansas City in the West, no contest.
No question there.
And then in the South, right now, it's the Texans.
Yeah, but
that
division's just garbage.
Yeah, but in terms, it's going to end up with the same question again. Everything's kind of at the top in terms of both conferences.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of the AFC, who do you think is your playoff teams there?
I think obviously when you got to go with the 1 seed, obviously I got to go with the Chiefs. Patrick Mahomes has been the biggest story this season. I think Drew Brees, MVP-wise, has been past him a little bit, but he's been really impressive. I think he's a much better improvement over Alex Smith when they had him. And him with Andy Reid is such a good combo. He has so many weapons. He has one of the best offensive lines in the game. He has Tyreek Hill. He's got Sammy Watkins, Travis Kelce, Kareem Hunt to hand the ball off to. And that's just who I see as the number 1 seed. Number 2, obviously, I think you got to go with the Patriots. I don't think the Steelers, with the way that they've played in certain games, tying with the Browns week 1, I don't remember who they've lost to really. I think one of them was the Ravens early on. But they've sort of bounced back a little bit, especially after now that whole Le'Veon Bell drama is done. So I think you put the Patriots at the 2, and then Steelers at the 3rd spot. 4th spot, I think it's just going to have to go to the Texans because they've been riding a hot streak since Deshaun Watson sort of picked up the pace, sort of picked up where he left off after a slow start to begin the year. So I think you got to give the 4th seed to the Texans. And then the 5th and 6th seed, I think you could just put the team names in a hat, with the exception of like the really bad teams, and just take your pick.
Yeah, I think in terms of the wild card, that's really where the question is, and man, it's hard to even speculate. I guess the Ravens are still in pretty good position.
Yeah.
San Diego, they had a last-second loss to the Broncos. Otherwise, they probably would have been in it. They're sort of on the edge as well. You look at it, there's a lot of these teams that are on the edge. The Titans is another team.
Yeah.
I think out of all of the teams, the Titans are probably the most likely because they're riding the momentum of that big Patriots win. And they've got a system that seems to work, but they have also lost some really stupid games. So I don't know. It's hard to say. I guess for me at this point, I'd have to say the Titans, and then probably the Chargers.
Yeah, this is how forgettable the Chargers have been. I didn't even think of them when I was.
Yeah, but this is how they've been.
They're a quiet 7-3 team.
Yeah, but this is how they've been for the past couple of years.
Yeah.
They just hang around at the middle of the pack, and then on the last week of the season, they either make the playoffs or they don't. And usually it's on some last-second play that just messes them up. And I don't know. I think the AFC is a much weaker conference right now. Almost undebatable that it is.
Yeah, there's no way of arguing that, I don't think, at all.
But let's shift on to the specific players. Talking about MVPs. who do you think is your AFC and NFC MVP? And in terms of the AFC, I think I've already got a pretty good idea.
I'd say AFC is definitely going to Patrick Mahomes.
Yep.
He's been the best player in the AFC by far. Tom Brady is, I think he's Father Time is finally starting to catch up with him at 41, I believe his age is now. He's still Tom Brady, obviously.
But he needs more help.
Yeah. I think Gronk's been injured. I haven't really been paying attention to the AFC that much, but he doesn't have the same weapons. Edelman was gone for the first 4 games with the PED suspension, and he lost Danny Amendola, and then, I say definitely Patrick Mahomes.
And then NFC, who do you think?
There are a lot more contenders in that field. You got your Drew Breeses, you got your Todd Gurleys. Jared Goff has been pretty good as well. But he has help with like a lot of weapons. Early on in the season, I would have said Kirk Cousins, but he's had a couple so-so games that I think have knocked him down a couple pegs. I'd say those top two, it's really between Drew Brees and Todd Gurley, but I would definitely have to go Drew Brees. He's just had an amazing season.
Yeah, I think for me, AFC, there's no question, it's Patrick Mahomes. NFC, I think, outside of the people you've talked about, one maybe off-chance person that could be talked about is Khalil Mack, who we saw last night. He's been all over everyone. He's been such a force on defense that he has to at least be in the question, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. He's been unstoppable. If he doesn't get MVP, he's basically a mortal lock for Defensive Player of the Year, even though I love Danielle Hunter, who's been about as effective, really.
Well, we'll have to see how the season plays out from here. It's certainly going to be interesting, especially with everything so close in both conferences. But we're going to be signing off here for today. We'll be back next week with more sports talk. But until then, I'm Jay Lennander.
I'm Joe Thompson.
And we'll see you next week.